And the Oscar goes to Everything, Everywhere.
On March 10th of 2024, the Oscars will happen for the 96th time.
This year, we had incredible voter turnout.
That means that the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences has been the leading voice in determining which film has been the best of each year for almost a century.
And the winner is Rocky, Irwin, Winkler, and Robert.
Parasite.
But it seems like recently people aren't taking the Oscars as seriously anymore. You have recent wins that were regarded as incredibly controversial. A lot of people don't necessarily agree with the way that they've approached their new diversity guidelines. It seems like they're doing a lot more PR than actual diversity. So the question is, do we let the Oscars continue their monopoly on what people think of these movies? Or do we keep pushing against them, trying to democratize the way that we talk about films, the way that we criticize them, and the way that we praise them? These are my picks for the 2024 Academy Awards, and these are my honest thoughts about each film. In 2019, Netflix released a film called The Irishman.
Fuck it, let's go.
Oh, Jimmy, give it a chance.
People were really upset about the 3.5-hour runtime. People were really upset that they used anti-aging technology in Robert De Niro. And finally, people were asking, he's made so many films where the guy grows up and gets all corrupt, goes after the money and the greed instead of actually honoring the relationships that he has in his life. And then the Oscars happened. The Irishman was nominated for 10 Oscars, and Scorsese watched as all 10 went away, and he didn't win a single one. But this year, Marty's back with The Killers of the Flower Moon, a historical epic that takes you through the true story of the murders of the Osage people by white men who were greedy for money and for gold. The thing is I'm not really sure why all the criticism that was thrown at The Irishman just kind of disappeared with this film, even though so many of the same issues exist. And in fact, I love The Irishman, but I think that with Killers of the Flower Moon, Marty was a bit too out of his comfort zone here. Now, before you get upset, I understand the arguments for Scorsese directing the film. I think that it's very valid that Scorsese is the reason why this film got all the attention that it got in the first place. I think that his reach as a director is one of the only reasons why Apple would give $200 million to a film like this.
Our great Martin Scorsese. So,
and I also think that Scorsese really did the work of trying to do the outreach necessary to really incorporate the present-day Osage community into the making of this film, to make it as authentic as possible, and to tell their stories in the way that they would have wanted it to be told. When I talked to my friend Annalise about Killers of the Flower Moon, I think that she kind of summarized my thoughts about the film exactly. When was the last time he directed a film that was centralized around a female protagonist? I think here in Killers of the Flower Moon, Lily Gladstone's character Molly is the crux of the film. Lily Gladstone's character is everything. She's the reason why Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Ernest Burkhart, even has a chance of growing as a character within this film. The story right now revolves around Leonardo DiCaprio's character. It just becomes kind of one note as you just watch Leonardo DiCaprio do the same thing over and over. And I also don't think it helps that Leonardo DiCaprio has played this exact character in so many Scorsese films that it's almost impossible to watch him on the screen and not be like, hold on, that's just Leo doing his thing. It should have been about Lily Gladstone from the beginning. It should have been about her character Molly, and it should have grown from there. And I think the fact that it became a Scorsese film kind of ruined its ability to really embrace the nuance of the story. I thought that the setting and the tone of the film were nailed. I think that Scorsese does a really good job of bringing you into this time period and into this story, but I don't think that this was a good story for him specifically to tell. I don't think that Killers of the Flower Moon was well executed enough to be genuinely considered Best Picture this year, considering how many other strong films we have to talk about. Now, on the flip side, I don't think that there's a single director alive right now that could have made Past Lives the way that Celine Song did. The film is about a girl who immigrates from Korea to the United States. She leaves behind a very close friend, a childhood crush even, and she builds her life as a writer in New York. Years later, she's married to a white man in New York City, but then her childhood crush comes to visit her, and things get a whole lot complicated. The story has an immense amount of heart, and I think it's very nuanced, and I think it takes a lot of knowledge about the situation to tell it so successfully. In fact, it's kind of in the Best Picture category in a way that none of the other films are. All of the other films in this category have relied on sets and technical work that require a lot of money to produce. But this was Celine Song's first feature. She chose to tell a story close to her heart that was very invested in its own characters, rather than trying to do anything grand. But in doing so, she was able to tap into something about modern love that for some reason felt universal. And even though I don't think Past Lives is realistically in the running for Best Picture, both for myself and for the Academy, it holds such a special place in my heart that I'm actually going to make an entirely separate video talking about how special it is for me personally. Speaking of expensive sets, I'm not really sure what I can add about the conversation to Barbie that hasn't already been shown to you by the marketing department or just by people online talking about it. I think that there's a very special thing about Barbie, even if it wasn't one of my favorite films of last year, because of how many people it touched and how many people it got to go to the theater. Because let's be honest, when it comes to Barbenheimer, Barbie was the one carrying that movement. But what I will say is that Greta, I love you. I love you so much. I think that your work is incredible. But please go back to what you were doing before. The Zone of Interest is a film directed by Jonathan Glazer, who is a British filmmaker who decided to make a film following a German family living on the outskirts of Auschwitz, the concentration camp, set during the time period of the Holocaust. I have a lot of thoughts about this film. I have to say that a lot of them are negative, but I'll talk more about them in the Best International Film category just because I don't really think it has a decent shot of winning Best Picture. American Fiction is a film directed by Cord Jefferson, talking about a black writer who is trying to navigate the complications of a whitewashed publishing industry, as well as grief within his own family at the same time. I think that it's a film that attempts to navigate these two separate storylines, one that's kind of an absurdist comedy and one that's genuinely a very soul-crushing family drama, but I'm not really sure it ever gets to the point where it balances these two particularly well. I think that if this film were to have been successful, it would have been able to walk the thin line between these two different parts of the story, but I'm not really sure it ever got there. And so because of that, it's probably the most surprising nominee for Best Picture this year. It ends up feeling kind of stereotypical and on the nose, and doesn't really feel unique like a lot of the other films nominated this year, nor does it really reach the levels of nuance that something like Past Lives got. Bradley Cooper's Maestro is a film that made waves this year, especially in the wake of a film like Tar. It is a new film exploring the dramatic world of classical music, following the life of Leonard Bernstein, one of New York's most premier conductors and composers of the last century. The film has already garnered a lot of controversy. A lot of people think it's boring, a lot of people think it's Oscar bait because of the way that Bradley Cooper sort of engineered this film around himself as an actor and as a director, and it's also gotten a lot of controversy surrounding this. The thing is I didn't really have a problem with any of these things when I was watching the film. I didn't think it was boring. I thought that his performance was pretty excellent, especially in the first half of the film. The problem with the film honestly just comes down to the story. I'm not really sure that you can make a film about such a legendary character like Leonard Bernstein and ignore so much of the musical side of his personality and of his personhood. I get it. At the end of the day, he's just a human being with flaws, and we want to be able to portray those flaws in a very honest and genuine way. But I also think it's completely disingenuous to have so much of his musical career and just be demonstrated by people talking about how talented he is, or he himself talking about how talented he is. There's very little that actually gets into his creative process and tries to unlock his creative process for us, which honestly is very disappointing considering that the film Maestro is also an actor trying to explore a creative process. I think when people call it Oscar bait, they're referring to the fact that he kind of chose the parts of Leonard Bernstein's life that are just easier to approach both as a director, an actor, and also as an audience. It's much easier to understand somebody who's cheating on his wife because we've seen it so much in the canon of film, more so than to dig at the truth of why did this person's music reach so many people and how did they create it. I grew up playing classical music. I have a lot of very close friends who grew up very deep in the classical music world, and I'm also going to make a separate video talking about Maestro and what real classical musicians genuinely think about the film and how it portrays their art form.
It is your body, Bella Baxter. Yours to give freely.
I generally charge 30 francs.
The problem is that with Poor Things, I'm really having a difficult time justifying why I hate it. I just know that I do. Directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, it follows a woman named Bella who underwent a surgery that placed a newborn child's brain into her adult woman's body. Because of this, she undergoes a lot of complicated relationships with men as she sort of rediscovers the world through this new perspective. It's beautifully shot, the set design is incredible, the way that they've sort of created this world around Bella is fantastic, and it really has a distinct personality that I think rivals even something like Barbie, which costs like 5 times the amount. What I think is lacking about the film is that I think it's very difficult for me to connect with characters that feel like they don't really have any sort of foundation in what I consider to be the human experience. What I mean by this is that Bella as a character stops being interesting to me after a while because it feels like every single decision that she makes, every single action that she takes is completely random and serves the plot rather than to ground her character in some aspect of what it means to be a human being. The thing is that there are people in the world who are a little bit immature, whose brains are a little bit underdeveloped. And the thing is that Bella doesn't really reflect any of the qualities that you would normally associate with somebody like that. After a while, she kind of spirals into this completely new being that honestly doesn't even feel human. At that point, the entire film and the entire character of Bella starts to feel more like a pure thought experiment, more so than anything that I can really connect with on a personal level. And I think that despite how wonderfully original Poor Things is, it's a classic example in my eyes of style over substance.
Oh.
The reason why I'm still struggling to really understand my own opinion about the film is that it feels kind of sad that I have to grip onto things that feel real or have a basis in real life, in naturalism, to really connect with them. I feel like I am a little jealous of all the people who seem to have gone to see this film and come away from it feeling like they just went on this wonderful, adventurous journey. It makes me feel like I'm missing something. What is it about this film and how it expressed itself that connected with so many people, but I can't connect with it? It's a frustrating feeling, but these are my thoughts, and I felt like sharing them with you. Okay, The Holdovers by Alexander Payne follows a high schooler named Angus Tully, who is forced to stay on campus during the winter holiday at his New England elite boarding school, and things get really complicated when his two companions happen to just be Paul Hunnam, who is one of the school's most detested teachers, and a woman named Mary who just lost her son to the Vietnam War. The thing is that I love The Holdovers so much that I actually don't have a ton to say about it. I've seen The Holdovers twice, and both times my brain just kind of turned off and I kind of just went along for a ride. And I get transported to this snowy location that feels somehow just like home. I think that I'm a big softie for films like The Holdovers that kind of take you back to your childhood and remind you what the most important things in life are. Especially when you have characters like Paul Giamatti who are making you laugh around every corner.
Also, he shot himself.
As much as I love The Holdovers, I don't think that it should win Best Picture. And I'm saying that literally as I'm wearing a Holdovers shirt. The reason is because I don't think a Best Picture is just a film that you love or that you enjoyed the experience. It has to make you grit your teeth and wonder, how did you do that? How did you pull that off? This year was Justine Triet who directed Anatomy of a Fall. This year, France's submission for Best International Film was The Taste of Things. After extensive research on Reddit, I feel like I have a really good idea of what happened. Basically, The Taste of Things is about two French chefs who fall in love because they cook a lot of French food together, and they said, oh, français. And basically, the committee was like, this is as French as it fucking gets, and they submitted that film instead. But also the more realistic reason is that Justine Triet went up at Cannes Film Festival when her film literally won the award, and she basically went up there and she said that I don't fuck with the French government. I think that probably had a reason to do with it. And if you go check out the Best International Film category, you might be wondering, where's The Taste of Things? Yeah, France kind of fucked up with that one. In Anatomy of a Fall, Sandra Hüller plays a German novelist who is quickly falling out of love with her French husband. One day, he literally falls out of a window. What ensues is a whirlwind court drama that completely takes over Sandra's life and her relationship with her visually impaired son. It's super sharp, it's witty, it's some of the best writing that I've ever witnessed performed on screen. I spent so much of my time after I watched the film for the first time wondering if the words that they said in certain scenes were actually the words that she wrote. It just didn't feel possible that a human being was capable of creating that out of thin air. I mean, watching Anatomy of a Fall with dreams of becoming a better writer is like me watching Kobe Bryant dunk on screen in fifth grade. It's like, I mean, I never got there. Not yet. I think that there's been a decent amount of criticism directed at this film because of how cerebral it is, how it really sinks into this question of morality and truth and what either of those even mean. I think they described the tension as being entirely centered around whether or not Sandra did it, whether or not she actually killed her husband. I think the beauty of this film is that for me, the tension stopped being about that. There was something about the way that Justine was able to explore her characters to such a complicated and deep and nuanced level. It really felt like I was in their world and understanding each decision that they made and reacting to the consequences of their decisions with them because I knew exactly the impetus for why they were committed in the first place. She really explored the way that human beings think and love and how these natural and instinctive emotions and feelings become corrupted by institutions of marriage and court that are incredibly necessary institutions, but at the end of the day, they really make us suffer. Anatomy of a Fall is still not the best picture of the year. In 9th grade, I had an open slot in my classes for an elective, and I applied to cooking because for some reason, me at that age was really excited about the fact that you could actually eat as part of the curriculum during school hours. I didn't actually get put into that class though, and I got put into a class called video film. That class was where I watched The Dark Knight for the first time. There's something deeply terrifying about that film in the way that it's able to unlock these intrinsic fears that don't really come out in your day-to-day life. I think it genuinely unlocks a part of your brain that has developed over years and years of ancestors looking at things and saying, there's something very, very wrong with what I'm looking at. As I kept watching more films by Christopher Nolan after that class, there's something about The Dark Knight that was just a step above everything else in terms of what it was able to accomplish in my own psyche as I was watching. A few years ago when I watched Tenet, I really felt like Christopher Nolan had lost it. It felt like he wasn't really going to come back to that quality. But with Oppenheimer,
Can you hear the music, Robert? Yes, I can.
he is at his best as both a writer and a director in this film, and he creates one of the most brilliant script adaptations and visuals ever seen on screen. When it comes to being the best all-around picture, the most well-produced picture, Christopher Nolan and Emma Thomas have everyone else beat. When I watched Oppenheimer for the first time, I watched the scene where Cillian Murphy, Oppenheimer, sits in the room with Casey Affleck, and I didn't get it at all. I couldn't understand what Oppenheimer was hinting at, or what he was trying not to reveal, or why he was even there, if he was going to be so sus and try not to talk about it anyways.
There's a man whose name was mentioned to me a couple of times. Elton. He talked to a friend of his who's an acquaintance of some another project.
And the rest of the film really came together for me, but I kept thinking about that scene and how I just didn't really understand what was going on. When I watched it for the second time, I paid extra attention to the build up to that scene. I still couldn't figure it out. The third time that I watched Oppenheimer, I finally understood the genius of that scene. The thing is this, when Oppenheimer goes with his baby to Chevalier and asks him, hey, can you take care of my baby? I think the initial takeaway is this dude is too busy, his wife is too busy, things are happening that are larger than taking care of a child. He's a physicist with massive dreams. He has no time in his career for a baby. But the thing is when Chevalier takes that baby from Oppenheimer, there's something that Oppenheimer now owes him. He feels like this is something that his friend has done for him that he needs to honor as a man, on a man-to-man level, on a person-to-person, human being to human being level. It has nothing to do with the ramifications of his actions in society like everything else that he's doing. It's just something that he has to honor on an individual level. But when Chevalier comes to him and tells him, hey, I have this guy who can relay information through different communist channels, Oppenheimer knows that he has to turn him in. But he still owes him. And so he tries to split the difference. He tries to do what's best for his country and what's best for progress, but he also tries to honor the thing that he owes this guy on an individual level. And the reason why I keep emphasizing the word individuals, because that's what this entire film is about. This film is about how people consider themselves on an individual level versus within the scope of history. And here, Oppenheimer is trying to find the middle ground between being his own person and being somebody within the scope of history. He's trying to do what is best for history and yet also what is best for the things that other individuals have done for himself as a human being. So much of this film has to do with balancing ego and your role as an individual within the greater scheme of things. And I think this scene is so brilliantly acted, so brilliantly written within the structure of the film as a whole. I love how it's so quietly hidden and yet so emblematic of what this film is really trying to touch, both about Oppenheimer's character and also about how human beings operate, just in general in the world. It's really beautiful. I'd even if you've seen the film before, I'd recommend going back and really taking a look at how he sets the scene up and what the ramifications are following the scene for who Oppenheimer is as he moves on, as he eventually does give up Chevalier, as he eventually does cede everything that is valuable to him as an individual person, and he just surrenders himself to the world as a whole.
Robert, you see beyond the world we live in. There is a price to be paid for that. Of course, we'll help you.
That's what this film is about. And it's so well written. The thing is do you give best adapted screenplay to a script like this, which requires so many viewings and so much thought and so much analysis just to even understand what is going on? Or do you give it to something like Barbie, which reached so many people and was so successful on such a wide international level? Do you give it to Poor Things, which was able to create opportunities for something so artistically individual? I think for me, this category still goes to Oppenheimer, just because Barbie and Poor Things felt a little bit like they were trying to cater to audiences and help them understand. I think Oppenheimer knew that on some level there were fundamental things that people could understand about the film, even if they weren't thinking too deeply about some of the elements, or even if they weren't catching on to some some of the elements. There's only so much that you can really miss when you're presented with a literal wall of fire, but then at the same time, it really unravels these layers of existential dread, and I think that that's really beautiful, and I think it's an accomplishment that ought to be rewarded. One of these films is not like the others in the sense that May December is only nominated for this category. It is a film about a real life story about a woman who seduced a 7th grader. She gets pregnant, she goes to jail, she comes back, she has the kid, they get married, they form a family. Despite the age difference, the woman is played by Julianne Moore, and a younger woman played by Natalie Portman is coming to join the family for a few weeks so that she can research the role for a biopic where she's going to play Julianne Moore. It's very meta. It's supposed to be campy, it's supposed to be funny and interesting and dramatic and heartbreaking, and frankly, I found it to be pretty insulting for what it's supposed to be. In my opinion, I think that this film was probably one of the biggest failures of the year, if not the worst film that I saw this year. May December is a film that is trying to expose the ridiculousness of the way biopics are created in Hollywood and the way that they go about exploring their subject matter. I think that this film at the same time is trying to dissect the intricacies of the relationship Julianne Moore does have with her husband, played by Charles Melton. When I say that it's supposed to be campy, there's this very ridiculous piano score that keeps coming in. The awkwardness is very palpable because it's so uncomfortable that what else can you do besides laugh? And I think that one of the reasons why it's uncomfortable is not just because of what the situation gives. It's uncomfortable because the film doesn't really know how to treat its own subject matter in the same way that it's criticizing other films in Hollywood for not knowing how to treat its subject matter. It is being exploitative in the same way. It's truly mistreating the characters that it's representing. Charles Melton's character is a projection of a person. Yes, it's very sad to watch, but it also feels very reductive to just reduce his character to being somebody who is just so inadequate and so inept. The real life story is so much more interesting. It feels like they were actually in love, or at least they believe that to be. I feel like the campiness of it is just because they didn't know what else to do with the subject matter, and so they just kind of made fun of it. It's not difficult because of what it reveals about its characters and about its story. I don't think it really reveals anything. I think you go into it knowing that pedophilia is wrong, and you come out knowing that pedophilia is wrong, and you don't really learn anything about why these characters chose to go down the routes that they did. And the film doesn't dare to take a stance on why the characters did either. Instead, it just kind of stays at the perimeter and pokes and prods at its subject matter until you can't help but laugh because of how poorly it's portrayed. I mean, Charles Melton is given so much praise, and in the end it's just, I think that this category is Anatomy of a Fall far and beyond deserving to win. I think this category, if it doesn't go to Anatomy of a Fall, I'll be shocked. I think this is the most one-sided category of the entire Oscars of this year. I'm excited to see Anatomy of a Fall win this award. In the biopic Rustin, Coleman Domingo plays Bayard Rustin, an openly gay man who was instrumental in helping Martin Luther King Jr. build the legacy that we now know today, except because of his sexuality, he was essentially erased from the history books. This is an example of a film that centers itself around a topic that is incredibly important to talk about. It's something that we as an audience ought to care about, and it's something that filmmakers ought to make. But when it comes to the film itself, it doesn't really give us a ton to care about. The images are drab, they're very gray and uninteresting. The filmmaking and the way that it's shot is also pretty unsatisfying, and the film as a whole seemed to have only cost $10 million. So how on earth are we supposed to compare Coleman Domingo's performance to Cillian Murphy's performance? I think Coleman Domingo is brilliant in Rustin. I think that he brings a lot of energy that is otherwise lacking in a pretty dreary film. Coleman Domingo probably gave just as much effort as Cillian Murphy, and yet one of them is the frontrunner for Best Actor in a Leading Role, and the other one most people haven't even heard about. When we talk about Best Acting Oscars, we talk about the films that people already love, we talk about the actors that people already love, and we talk about the characters that people already love. But how do we distinguish between them? Do we give the Oscar to Cillian Murphy, who plays Oppenheimer in a way that is very quiet? Things are building inside of him, but he's not necessarily showing them. It's a very endearing commitment to a character who we get to watch over the course of 3 hours grow into something very new and different. But at the same time, you have somebody like Paul Giamatti, who's constantly firing on all cylinders with the lines that he's delivering in such funny and unique ways. They're honoring what their directors gave them, and they're honoring the amount of money and effort that was poured into a film. So much of acting is so disconnected from the actual spirit of the acting, the actual technique of the acting. It's almost impossible to really distinguish, was this because Cillian Murphy is brilliant? Or is it because Christopher Nolan got hundreds of millions of dollars to literally recreate the atom bomb and have Cillian Murphy stare at it blow up in front of his face, and giving him the ability of being the man who thought that this was his creation? I think at the end of the day, there's only one thing to agree on, and that's Bradley Cooper probably doesn't deserve this Oscar. I will say that something that I've really neglected to talk about in my discussion of Maestro is Carey Mulligan's performance. I don't want to detract from the fact that her performance in this film is actually quite amazing. There's that one scene where she's sitting in the hotel and she's talking about her relationship with Leonard Bernstein. She starts to reveal something deep inside of her, and the way that she does it is very artful and very calculated.
It's just so ironic. I would look at everyone, even my own children, with such pity because of their longing for his attention. It was sort of a banner I wore so proudly I don't need.
The film has given you so little to know about her that when she does finally let it slip just a little bit at this table, you're able to grab onto it and go, wow, there's actually something in this film where I learned something about the characters that isn't just blanket statements about their sexuality and their faithfulness. And that's kind of the general story for a lot of the women in this category. I think that Lily Gladstone, like I said before, should have been the centerpiece of Killers of the Flower Moon, but it just wasn't in the cards for her. I will say that Lily Gladstone does have a decent chance of winning this Oscar, just because of the place that Killers of the Flower Moon occupies within the mainstream culture in America at the moment. I think that Emma Stone has a very good chance of winning this Oscar. I think that she gives a great performance in Poor Things, but this is the thing. Did Poor Things depend more on Emma Stone, or did Anatomy of a Fall depend more on Sandra Huller? Because I think when we talk about Sandra's performance in Anatomy of a Fall, it's almost impossible to separate her and what's good about the film. Sandra Huller is so vital and critical to creating not only this question of did she do it in the film, but also just bringing out so many layers to a woman who's living away from her home country in an isolated area, raising a son with a disability. So much of it is crucial to her being able to craft a realistic and layered depiction of a woman who genuinely would be in that situation. I think it's almost impossible for me to imagine a world where Sandra Huller does not deserve winning an Oscar for the role that she plays in Anatomy of a Fall. I think that this film touches so many places emotionally, and it's because of the emotional range that she's able to demonstrate in this film. And I think that that's what it takes to win Best Actress in a Leading Role. If you were to go up to somebody who has seen all 5 of these films and to ask them, who do you think should win Best Supporting Actor? I guarantee you, most people will say either Mark Ruffalo or Robert Downey Jr. But why? Why is it that there's such a shared confidence that they did the best in this category? In fact, I would argue that Mark Ruffalo and Ryan Gosling have more or less the same role. Both of them are very immature and childish and represent an aspect of the film that is to be laughed at and is to be made fun of until you realize that there's something more serious brewing under the surface that maybe needs to be considered. The whole point of both of their characters is to demonstrate the maturity of their female counterparts. So why is it that Mark Ruffalo is automatically going to be considered above Ryan Gosling 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10? Or is it just the fact that Poor Things is more of an artistic endeavor as opposed to a literal capitalist regime that is being celebrated? The more that I think about it, the more that I feel like the best actor categories are really just a way to celebrate the way that the filmmaker went about portraying the character. So much of it is left up to the script and the director. So little of it is actually the actor. 9 times out of 10, the reason why people want a certain actor to win is because they love that film. The context of the film surrounding the actor cannot really be severed. How do you judge an award that so individualizes the role that they had, as if the context wasn't there? In Killers of the Flower Moon and also in American Fiction, so much of the thesis of the film takes place without really any involvement from Robert De Niro or Sterling K. Brown. I mean, they give very good dramatic performances. They both really embrace the role that they're in, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily carry any sort of weight within the general purpose of the film. And I think that because of that, Robert Downey Jr. is just a slight step ahead of them. Robert Downey Jr.'s character really represents a massive theme within the film, which is an individual ego versus the progression of humanity as a whole. Personally, again, I'm going to go with Robert Downey Jr. What I was going to say is that I'd much rather see an actor delve into something that they're not comfortable with. Robert Downey Jr. is so often associated with Iron Man and being lighthearted that seeing him in such a serious role was kind of something special in itself. But then Mark Ruffalo also doesn't really do what he did in Poor Things. So maybe I just answered my question as to why these two are the frontrunners, because they did something that neither of them really do in their own careers, and they've done something completely different in a very successful and convincing way. So maybe that is why. Interesting. Maybe talking to yourself at a wall for 3 hours is going to get you somewhere after all. I don't know. So we have two newcomers in this category that need to be discussed, Nyad and The Color Purple. So Nyad is a film directed by two documentary filmmakers who have decided to tell the biopic of a woman named Diana Nyad who swam from Florida to Cuba. And the reason why I mention that they're documentary filmmakers is because I do think that this film kind of struggles to navigate the thin line between am I a documentary, am I a biopic? There's very confusing usage of newsreels throughout the beginning. There's also these more traditionally narrative flashbacks that come in that really disrupt the flow of everything. When the filmmakers themselves are fiddling with the form, you start to become aware of the fact that they're trying to manipulate the form for a certain reason. And what I came away with is that they're trying to use these newsreels as a way of saying, hey, this actually happened. Look at how important this was. Please care about this person that we're telling the story about. And then the flashbacks to her childhood that are completely different actors, and it's just sort of confusing why it relates. Now what that tells me is, hey, now you have to actually care about the characters emotionally so that we can get some kind of emotional reaction out of you once we get to the end. They're too concerned with the film to actually give me something new within the story. This is all to say that Jodie Foster does an excellent job at being an actress who really captures your attention. But beyond capturing your attention, what else is there to really know? Besides just acknowledging that she's there and that she's Jodie Foster and that she's making a comeback.
Yeah! All right.
Unfortunately, I have to kind of go down a similar route with Danielle Brooks in The Color Purple. The Color Purple is about a young black woman who's surviving a lot of different traumatic experiences in the South. As she's growing up, she loses track of her sister because of the way that her father sort of disposes her from the family. But it all feels a little bit too theatrical because the entire movie you're trying to figure out why they decided to tell the movie in the ways that they did. I mean, they're trying to take not only a Spielberg film that was very successful, but a Broadway show that was very successful, and trying to meld these two things into some kind of musical theater film combination that for the most part isn't really working. The film is a bit too messy to really appreciate the way that every individual actor kind of brings out their own spirit in their characters. I say this because with Danielle Brooks, I mean, she gets an Oscar nomination because of the way that she's able to demonstrate this spirit that really is resonating within her, but I'm just not really sure how to evaluate her performance within the context of the film, which is in general just a bit sloppy in terms of its execution. It's very difficult to say no to both Danielle Brooks and Jodie Foster because they are both shining forces within films that are otherwise pretty dull because of the fact that their directors and their producers kind of got lost within the form of constructing the film from the ground up. What my mind goes to is a very intense showdown between Emily Blunt in Oppenheimer and Divine Joy Randolph in The Holdovers. I think Emily Blunt really delivers a performance of the lifetime. I think in a film that for the most part really undervalues its female characters, and that has been a consistent takeaway throughout the 3 times that I have seen this film, Emily Blunt continues to overwhelm me with the way that she's able to capture the spirit of her character, even with just the small amount of lines and the small amount of character work that she's given. Whereas Divine Joy Randolph really elevated the Holdovers film. Somebody who's dealing with grief and yet dealing with their own place in the world at the school that they've been for so long, at a place that reminds them of her son because this is where he went before he ended up going to Vietnam. My gut is telling me that the Academy will probably end up going with Divine Joy Randolph just because her role in The Holdovers is bigger than Emily Blunt's role in Oppenheimer. People will go to The Holdovers and remember Divine Joy Randolph more than they will go to Oppenheimer and remember Emily Blunt.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
And that's all I have for you for this video. Thank you to Annalise for all of your help. I'm Ryan, and thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe.